We are live. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to GDG Broward County. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have a new topic: streamline your software development. Are we trying to do too much? That's a common question that we always do in our development process. But before we get started, introduce our speaker today. Please. Thank you for joining the community. Continue to follow us. We do have more areas to cover and to talk about. We do have a data engineering series that's ongoing. We have another session scheduled for April, and we have coming up a web development and AI engineering series as well. So thank you. And now I'm gonna yield to our speaker today, Grant. Thank you for joining us. And go right ahead. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Oscar. Hey, do you want to stop sharing?
It's all yours.
All right, there we go. Hey, thanks, Oscar. I'm Grant Murata. I'm an agile coach and trainer. And one of the things I love talking about is workflow. So that's what we're here to do today. As in all my talks, if you've been to other ones, really, we're going to talk about improving our workflow. More specifically today about addressing our work in progress, or our WIP, or more accurately, the amount of work that we have in progress. We're going to talk about why it's so important. And in the business we do as knowledge workers, we need to be aware of it, why we should know how to manage it and make the best use of it for best results. The picture here, while it may be an exaggeration, but maybe not that much, right? There are teams and companies out there, I guarantee you, with something like this, whether they're visualizing it or not. So first, I wanted to cover briefly, let's take a look at flow metrics. Okay, just so you have a basic understanding. First, there's cycle time, or how long it takes something to complete, from the start of our workflow to the end of our workflow. Then there's throughput, and simply put, that's the number of items we complete per unit of time, or the rate at which we're getting things done. Then there's, of course, work in progress. We'll get back to that. And then finally, there's work item age. Work item age is perhaps the most important of all, but that can easily be part of a whole nother talk. So today we're going to focus on work in progress. That's all the stuff in the middle here, the stuff that has entered our workflow but not yet exited. It's still in progress. It's still being worked on. Once we start something, whether we realize it or not, we've created a commitment to finish it. Or at least I hope we have, since as a company, we've committed valuable resources to working on it. Why is it important? Well, it's what the team's currently working on. It is at this point in time what's moving the team and maybe even the company forward. Somehow, some way, at some point, we decided, or whoever makes the decisions decided, the best thing to do was to work on this stuff right now. So I have to ask, is there really anything more important than this? Moving forward, we really can't have a discussion about work in progress without talking about Little's Law. And this should help explain why it all matters. Dr. John Little, a professor from MIT in the mid-1960s, he discovered an important relationship involving these flow metrics, the ones we just went over, including, of course, work in progress. It's become known as Little's Law, and it's a very important law in queuing theory. And he was able to provide mathematical proofs. So this interpretation of the law simply states that the average cycle time equals the average work in progress divided by the average throughput. Cycle time, again, how long it takes to get things done or to flow through our defined workflow. WIP, of course, is how many things we have in progress. And throughput is the number of work items we can complete per unit at a time. It could be stories per day, per week, or maybe features per week or per month, something like that. So let's look at this. Assuming we want to improve our cycle time, like all teams do, meaning we want to get things done faster. Based on Little's Law, there are a couple of things we can do. We can improve or increase throughput, right? There are ways to do this. We can hire more people. That's probably the simplest thing to do. We can make our current people work overtime. We can whip them. We can invest in better tooling and maybe techniques of working. These are all possible, but perhaps maybe not the most desirable options. We certainly don't want to burn people out, and we certainly don't want to spend more money than we have to. So, number two, the far, far, far easier thing to do is to control or lower our work in progress, the amount of stuff we're working on. And we can do this today. Simply go back to your team and say, hey, we're going to do less. We'll get things done faster by doing less. More importantly, by doing this, we'll get our highest priority items done sooner. So one important note on Little's Law. You may notice each of the fields is an average. Average cycle time equals average WIP divided by average throughput. For this reason, please, please, please do not do any forecasting or estimation calculations based on this formula. I know it's tempting. This is one of the mistakes that SAFe makes, Scaled Agile. But with it based on averages, it falls victim to the flaw of averages, which is covered in the book of the same name by Sam Savage. It explains that any plans made based on averages will, on average, be wrong. A simple example of this, say Elon Musk joined our meeting today. In addition to us all being pretty amazed, we would all, on average, be multi-billionaires. So no estimates using Little's Law. In fact, I say no estimates at all, but that's part of another talk. But then, why are we talking about Little's Law? What good is it? Why am I spending so much time on it? The relationship between these three flow metrics is what is important here. The idea that if we're diligent about controlling and keeping our WIP low, then we will control and likely lower our cycle times and get the most important stuff done faster. That is the main takeaway. And really, that is the primary basis for lean thinking and agile in the first place. If you're interested, last I checked, Dr. Little is still alive at the ripe age of 96, living somewhere in the New England area. So, WIP limits, that's what we're here to talk about. What most teams do to control WIP is to apply WIP limits. Assuming you have a workflow board of some kind, and I hope you do, I hope you're visualizing your work. Simply stated, a WIP limit for a column on a workflow board means that at any given time, we should not have more than that number of items in that column. That's what that number, that WIP limit number means. Some teams may use a board WIP limit, meaning if you add up all the work in progress items across the board, they should not exceed that amount of work items. That's fine. Either way, a WIP limit is a simple, effective way to visualize and control our work in progress. What are the right WIP limits? How do you know what the right WIP limits are? Well, you probably don't. And frankly, neither do I. And at first, you're not expected to know, and that's okay. Some teams may base it on the number of people on the team, or for each column, they'll base it how many team members they have that have the expertise required to perform the work for that column. For instance, it's common if the team has 2 QA analysts, they may limit the number of items in the QA column to 2. That's quite common. There's really no right or wrong answer here. It's all about the learning. I suggest trying it out and then adjust as necessary. The general rule is if we have too much idle work, then the WIP limits might be too high. If we have too many idle people, the WIP limits may be too low. In my experiences, more often than not, they're too high. Teams tend to not want to be constrained by WIP limits, so they tend to make them higher than they should be. This is a challenge in general. It really takes a mature and diligent team to lower and respect the limits to be at optimal levels. So if based on the WIP limits, a team member has no work to do, that doesn't really mean it's time to raise the limits. That's not the end of the world. They can help another work item in progress to get across the finish line, or maybe in some way to move forward. They can do research. Optimal flow will at times leave team members without work, and that's okay. Don't freak out about it. A pull system. So once we have WIP limits in place, this will help establish what's called a pull system. What I mean by this is a work item will only move forward when there's room for it in the next stage. In other words, it is pulled forward when someone is ready to work on it, and only when someone is ready to work on it. A pull system generates good flow of work, and it will likely lead to faster, more reliable, and predictable delivery times. How about exceeding our WIP limits? So while it's important to be diligent about respecting WIP limits, would there be a time when the team should allow a WIP limit to be exceeded? So keep in mind, these numbers are guidelines. They can be adjusted as we're trying to get optimal flow, and or maybe the team goes through changes. And yes, a WIP limit can be exceeded. So what is important is that the team does this with the eyes wide open, that they have a discussion about it. If at that time it's in the best interest of the team and the organization to take on more work, then we should do it. Now, this does not mean the floodgates are open and we start taking on everything. Don't be silly about it. But when the team meets again during the next stand up or maybe the next retrospective, they can decide if the WIP limits need to be adjusted. So I read an article a while back about what is the optimal amount of WIP. I want to share this. It went through some calculations based on the number of team members, the number of work items, the expectations. There were a few other variables involved. And in the end, it came up with a number N. Then it said the ideal WIP equals N minus N plus 1. I can pause for a second for you to do the math. But while kind of funny, that is in fact the ideal WIP, 1. So while it isn't always possible or practical to put all resources on one work item, 1 is indeed the ideal number of work items to have in progress. And in theory, it would be getting our highest priority item done as quickly as possible. So what I have teams and organizations do in order to more naturally get to the optimal number of WIP items is something called the saturation model. The way it works is this. Take the highest priority work item and keep putting people on it until it doesn't make sense to add any more people. Then take the next highest priority item and do the same thing, and so on until we run out of people, or maybe we run out of work items. This will naturally put the right number of people on, the right number of items in progress, and it might help us create WIP limits for us. So the saturation model method, it works regardless of whether we're talking about a team or an organizational level workflow. For instance, at the portfolio level, we may be putting multiple teams on a single high-level work item, an initiative, for instance. At the team level, we may be talking about putting several team members on, for example, one single user story. Multitasking. So we can't talk about WIP without talking about multitasking. Developers love to multitask. In fact, you may see it on a resume. I'm great at multitasking. So as a developer, I was the best multitasker. I know I was the best. I could have 3 or 4 things going on at once, and I really kind of took pride in that. But what I did not realize at the time was that multitasking is really the enemy of flow. No matter how good you are, if you're working on more than one thing at a time, you're really just time slicing. So while you're working on one thing, something else is sitting idle and aging. So please, please, please resist the urge to multitask. In fact, we should embrace the opposite, having multiple people work on one work item. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I've been asked, this all sounds great, but what if we're behind schedule? And it happens to me, I'm sure it happens to you. Sometimes we fall behind schedule. And when we do, you may see managers or project managers, they'll look at cycle times and think, well, if things are taking this long to get done, then we better get everything in progress. We better get everything started. This is a common trap, and we'll end up creating a downward spiral. We only have to look back a few minutes ago to Little's Law to understand this. Just like the Little's Law relationship shows, if we lower our WIP, we will lower our cycle times and get stuff done faster. The opposite is also true. If we allow WIP to increase and we take on more work, it will by definition increase our cycle times and things will take longer to complete. It does not help the situation at all. In fact, working on less will most times help the situation. So by definition, even though great effort unfortunately, may have gone into prioritizing items. When we put multiple items in progress, we're basically saying they're the same priority. We're utilizing company resources on each of them. So in theory, they're being treated as the same priority. Think about that before moving an item to in progress. There are forecasting tools which I can recommend, which can help us plan or replan and set expectations on work completion. I suggest using these regularly to monitor progress and adjust expectations as needed. So, changing priorities. Has this ever happened to you? What happens to WIP if priorities change? So this is inevitable, right? It happens to all of us. Picture this. The team is chugging along, doing good work, right? They're completing items quickly, keeping WIP low and looking good, doing all the right things
Mhm.
to have great workflow. Something happens, and guess what? The main work item they're working on is not the highest priority item anymore. Unfortunately, this does happen. Well, what should the team do? It's a tough situation, and there's probably a few questions that may help. Okay. What I would do is go to the team and say, hey, can we deploy and get any value what's been completed so far? Another question, does it make sense to complete it before taking on the now higher priority work item? Are we at a point where it makes sense to put the completed stuff on the shelf and save it for later? Should the work completed so far be completely abandoned? Does it apply anymore? Perhaps should part of the team continue working on it in addition to taking on the higher priority work? So, based on the answers to these questions, the team and maybe the company can decide what's the best way to move forward. So, you may ask about expedites. Expedites are a necessary evil, right? And kind of an enemy of flow. But it's inevitable. Many teams will leave open a process that will allow the possibility of receiving expedited work items. You kind of have to. For the sake of the business, if something needs to get done urgently, we can't say no. So it may be that money is leaking or a customer is in some way suffering, right? These things need to be addressed. And unfortunately, it may take one or more team members away from the committed work for some time. So expedited items, just to clarify, work items that come in as the highest priority and are fast tracked into the workflow for the team to address now, right? The team and the organization, however, they should be very careful about how an expedited item is defined. Sometimes very well-meaning but overly zealous product people may take advantage of this to push forward work based on their own agenda. This can affect flow, right? It cycle times and the delivery of work items we've committed to, and in general could make the team look bad. And more importantly, it's not good for the organization. So handle expedites carefully. They will affect our flow of work. It's important to have policies around how they're handled.
So, Grant, so just to quick question. So, handle your whip properly or your job properly, right? So a lot of these things is it's not just a development team, right? It's management, is everything, the entire team all together. So who's really responsible for this, right? So for example, you may have developers say, look, um, I can manage this, but I cannot take on this right now, right? But management is saying, no, you have to, So who manages this, right? So what I see here is that I see the constant struggle between development and management, and in both teams, if they're not really in sync, having different opinions about what should be expedite or what should be a priority and so on, right? So how do you manage, how do you govern this relationship so things can run smoothly?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know if we have time to fully answer that question today, but let me take a stab at it. So I think what you're actually getting to is company culture. So is a team allowed to say no? If they say, hey, we got to work on this, but you got to finish that, the team should allowed to say, hey, it's one or the other, and be able to push back, right? They're not helping the team or helping the organization in that case. And I think you hit it on with part of that, the relationship between management and the team members. To me, it comes back to culture. The team has to look out for themselves, but at the same time, they're serving the organization. So they have to be able to get the work done and have their work flow. So, if they're put in a no-win situation, the team leadership needs to stand up for the team and address that. But that's a great question. I've seen it before. Cultures where the team they want to please, they want to give answers, they want to tell management what they want to hear, but they may not feel empowered to do that, and that's not a good situation. So I think doing the things we're talking about here, and when you see the team succeed, it leads to a better culture. Will they feel empowered to do that? But that's a great question, and I think that really comes back to creating and nurturing the culture within the organization to do that.
As
Hey,
a
let's boldly. Oh, go ahead.
as a as a follow up, right? Because it's a company culture. I think a lot of us have gone through that. So often is the case that this kind of process management or process improvement initiatives and all that, they are kind of oriented towards the development team, towards the technology teams, and so on. But do you think that this kind of process or this kind of philosophy should be also um, I guess, followed by the management team, right? So, what is your position when it comes to everything that we're hearing today? Is this towards only the dev team, the entire organization? What's your, I guess, your feedback on that?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. You've touched on one of my pet peeves. So I've gone into many different organizations and dealt with leadership. And it's funny, leadership's all for doing this, but when it comes to them, they say, "Oh, that's not for us. That's for the teams." They don't realize that they're part of it, right? And the basic principles apply to them as well. So I love that you touched on that. Absolutely, I'd love to get team leaders, middle management, upper management, C-level people on here to understand these basic principles. I think in some way they do, but they don't want to deal with it. To them, this is like, oh, this is a team thing. Hey, Grant, just go take care of the team. So that's one of the huge challenges in what I do, is to get the leadership to internalize that, hey, this is for us too. We're a big part of this.
Right.
And so it,
Yes.
it, it all kind of ties together.
Yes, I agree because I mean, if management raise this is difficult, right? I mean, because development that your teams can follow through this and understand WIP and understand all of this, don't do too much. But then management, and I've heard this in the past in multiple companies, right? The concept of management saying, but a developer can do more, right? A
Mhm.
developer can multitask, that kind of concept, which is really what I mean. You're basically telling us right now how to improve our process, right? By not doing those things, but yet management, even though they're the ones advocating for this kind of stuff and have better controls around the development technology teams, they're the first ones to sort of come in and break the process, right? Because they're like, they forget about this concept and they're like, oh no, I this is a priority, so therefore we should just turn on a dime and do this.
Yeah, and I get it. In some ways, it's non-intuitive, but they're willing to pay someone like me really good money to come in and work with their teams. But when it comes to them, it's like, hey, no, I'm good. So it's kind of funny how that works out. Maybe by doing things like this, we can help with that. But these messages really are for the whole organization. Great point, Oscar. So let me get back to this. This is something I alluded earlier. So what if we have more work people than work items? I talked earlier about multitasking and how bad it is. And I mentioned ideally we want multiple people working on one work item. So when we have more people than work items, or maybe the WIP limits say we have more people than work items we're allowed to work on, that kind of forces this scenario. When two or more team members work on one item, it's called pairing. Now, this term, for some reason, it's kind of gotten a bad rap in some development circles. Some developers consider pair like a four-letter word. I get it. They want to work on their own thing by themselves. Maybe in a scarcity kind of way. They're wary of the transparency that pairing brings, or they want the sole credit for the achievement. Both of these really go against what we're trying to do here. We want transparency for everything, and we want credit really to be shared by the team. So pairing, while sometimes may slow things down a bit, the shared knowledge and learnings, the improved quality, the ability to have multiple people know an area of code, those far outweigh the extra time it may take. Also, some teams have eliminated the peer review step in the workflow when the item is completed using pairing, which in turn speeds things up a bit. So in some cases, the team may even decide to swarm. This is the case where usually it's an emergency, but the whole team works on one item. So having more people than work items is not a bad thing. In fact, it's the ideal scenario. Think about this when deciding on team WIP limits.
So, so how do you manage visibility, right? So one of the concepts, for example, when you have a, a big work item, right? So there's a process of decomposing that work item. So because maybe it's too big, right? Maybe it's too
Mhm.
big. Even the work item is too big that it really requires 2 to 3 people to do this. But those 2 or 3 people are going to decompose that work item into tasks, which at this point, then if you look at Kanban board, you will see more work in progress, right? As they are defining new tasks for doing the back end, the front end, the integration, the APIs, and so on, right? How do you, I mean, where does that come in, right? Because from one work item, this, the normal process is you decompose it, everybody gets their own task, and everybody's actively working on that.
Mhm.
But then the visibility now shows that it's multiple work items for that one. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, let me start at the beginning there. So, yeah, transparency is one of the main tenets of Agile. So, we want to make the work transparent. And there's plenty of great soft tools out there, some better than others, but which will allow that transparency. And I like the direction you went there about decomposing work items. So, this is something on the team. In fact, we're just about to talk about right sizing our work, but this is a great time for that question. Is if we get a work item and the team decides, hey, there's more than one work item here, they should be encouraged to break it up into multiple work items. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all those work items are in progress. If they break it up into multiple, maybe only one of those is in progress and the rest of them wait. And then their flow will continue, right? Because they'll be working what I like to call right-sized work items, and it'll all be visible. So if they break it up into tasks, that's something different. Maybe the work item is right sized to begin with. And personally, I don't care whether the team uses tasks or not, but if it's to their benefit to have tasks to help them coordinate, great. And we can even look at tasks on a separate workflow level as a task workflow, just like we look at higher level work items, initiatives, and features at a higher level workflow. So it's all about the flow of work, and the principles apply regardless of what level we're working at. But the nice thing is it should be transparent to everyone,
Correct.
and you should have the ability to dig down all the way down to the bottom level to see the state. And another thing,
Yes.
since you brought this up, is we are at the mercy of people updating their stuff.
Right, right.
So
No, but in addition of the is the visibility and the traceability, right? So meaning that you have one big work item, um, or user story, right, which gets
mhm.
worked on, but the team creates independent tasks, and those tasks are correlated or associated to these user stories, and the code that is worked on and checked in is associated to this task. So that gives us traceability to sort of understand who did what was the change about, what caused that change, and so on.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I'm less. It's nice to have the traceability. I'm less concerned with who did what. One of the things I hate about most tools, Jira included, is that every work item has to have one person's name on it as the owner. And I talked already a bit about we want multiple people, and that's one of the things with that traceability. Some companies will do that, right? They'll look back at review time and say, "What have you done?" And they can do traces within the tool. And if you worked on stuff but your name was never on it, you might be backwardly incented to try to get your name on stuff, and that's not really the attitude that we want. So, it kind of incents people the wrong way to maybe want their own work item, like we talked about earlier, rather than
Yes,
having to pair and work together on stuff.
I agree. That's kind of for me kind of I mean, because all the organizations that I've been to, there is so massive reporting on productivity,
Mhm.
right? For that developer, so you has to be linked to something independently to capture your productivity. So so it's the constant, I guess, culture of I want to see how much work you do, right, and the velocity of your work, and how many user story points can you knock off, and so on and so
Oh, stop with the points, but okay.
on.
But yeah, so to kind of put a bow on that, yeah, it could be a whole nother talk, but how employees are incented is very important. for this and for culture and so forth. So I love the segue because we're talking about sizing our work, and I wanted to talk a little bit about right sizing. I'm not going to get through all of right sizing, but I've heard it said that the stuff I'm talking about only applies if all our work items the same size. And I've heard that said about Kanban in general. So please, 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 this is a myth. Do not try to make all your work items the same size. Even if it were possible to do that, it's not what we're trying to do. Work items will be different sizes. They'll have different cycle times when they're completed. This is normal. So what I work with teams to do is to make work items as small as practical, right? Does it provide feedback of some kind? Can it move forward on its own? Is it able to be tested? These are all valid questions to ask when trying to determine if a work item is the right size. Also, there's tools and flow metrics out there that can help with right sizing. But again, that could be a whole nother talk. I could spend hours covering that. Speaking of work item size, which we just were, teams, I've seen this, teams will sometimes hide WIP by pushing forward large work items. And then as Oscar was saying, if the team is able to, they may break them into multiple items. But if a work item should really be 2, 3, or 4 or more work items, it's really just more WIP. So this is something to look out for. If our work items are not right sized, it will affect our WIP management, and therefore our cycle times and our deliveries will suffer. We're not going to get into how to right size right now, but again, that's for another time. Kanban. So I love Kanban. I'm primarily a Kanban trainer. Do we need to be using Kanban to take advantage of this? Right? Those of you who know me know I like to teach Kanban. Of course not. That's a myth.
Can
These are
you
basic.
can you
Go
give
ahead,
an
Doc.
overview of what is Kanban?
Sure, sure. Kanban is really a set of practices. Okay, it's not a methodology unto itself, but it's a set of practices to enable flow. It's about creating our workflow. It's about managing a workflow, and it's about approving our workflow. The basic flow principles. They apply regardless of what methodology we're using. So you can say we're doing Kanban, and that's great, right? But you can be doing Scrum and doing Kanban practices. You can be doing basically anything and using the Kanban practices. So it's really there to improve flow. So say you're using Scrum and you have iterations or sprints. One thing I'd like you to do is check your progress mid-sprint and ask yourself this: is all the work half done, or is half the work all done? So ideally, the team will have either half or some of the work completed and will have delivered that value and will have gotten all the good feedback and learnings that go with it. If all the work is only half or partly completed and little or nothing is done, then work in progress is likely too high and there's an opportunity for improvement. So I've seen it on Scrum teams on day one. All the work goes into progress, and by mid-sprint, nothing is completed. So watch out for this. There's an area for improvement there. We could imply WIP limits and use Kanban practices there. So whatever system you're using, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, XP, SAFe, Waterfall, maybe something hybrid or unnamed, check how the work is flowing, and there's a good chance by lowering or at least controlling WIP, flow can be improved. So one thing we have not discussed so far is the impact of WIP on quality. We did discuss multitasking or juggling multiple items simultaneously. That will almost assuredly impact quality in a negative way. Working large work items also affects quality and delivery. So picture this: when there's a defect. I think we've all been there trying to troubleshoot a defect. Most of developers' time is spent finding the defect, perhaps maybe even debugging the problem. Most often, once the defect is found, it's fixed relatively quickly. The smaller the work item, the smaller the scope of change, the fewer places that need to be checked to determine the possible root cause of the defect, and the quicker it's fixed. The larger the work item, the potentially much larger the scope of change, and it could take considerably longer to find and then fix, delaying the completion of that work item and possibly even delaying an entire release. Something to think about. All right. We've talked a lot here in a relatively short period of time. Hopefully, this has helped to show the importance of controlling the amount of work we have in progress. It is one of the most important things we can do to create and maintain a stable development system, which I talk a lot about stable development systems. Too much work at the same time will slow us down and will take focus and resources away from what truly are our highest priorities. So, to summarize, being diligent about controlling our work in progress it will allow us to get things done faster. And more importantly, it will help get our highest priority items completed sooner. It will improve quality. It will improve focus. It'll help us be more predictable, which, by the way, has been cited as the number one reasons companies adopt agile practices in the first place. Excuse me. It will help us to get feedback sooner, which of course helps us iterate to ideal solutions faster. That's about it. If you're still watching, thanks for your time. I hope this has been helpful in some way for your software development journey.
Grant,
Thank
one more item on that on the review. I would
Sure.
I will say also that it will make as item number 7. It improves the overall team happiness. Right.
Happiness. You can't
Right.
underestimate happiness. You're right.
And I think that's key because it will eliminate conflict, stress. It will just completely improve productivity. I mean, it's just it's a building block for everything that happens, right? So I think that to me is
Yes.
one of the biggest milestones to achieve here, which is complete team satisfaction and quality and happiness.
I love that. And that again, when we do that talk about motivating team members, I think that would be a huge part of it. The happiness of the team, the commitment of the team, the camaraderie on the team. That's all,
Right.
it's all good stuff.
Yeah, which is has been a challenge in all the places that I've been to, is being, just to try to keep that team very healthy and happy and satisfying, and feel, and have that feeling of accomplishment is very important. But thank you. It was a great conversation and presentation, Grant. Thank you for joining us today. So we have another question here from Lamarco. What software is better to manage work in progress? So is it Jira, GitHub? What's your input?
So, yeah, I'm not as familiar with I've been away from development for some time. Is not as familiar with the offerings of GitHub. Jira doesn't. I mean, you can view a Jira board and kind of get an idea. Um, I prefer to use a tool called Actionable Agile. If you go ahead and look it up, and it gives you a much better visual of all the work in progress. But Jira, you can look at the board and count up what's going on. Jira will allow you to put in WIP limits, which is awesome. And the columns, I believe, if you exceed the WIP limits, it will turn red and call it out. So it forces the team during stand up to say, someone should say, "Hey, that column's red. What are we doing here?" And you can address what the issues are then. So I mean, they all kind of do the same thing. Some are better than other. Jira's fine, Rally's fine. They're all fine. And but the thing is, the team needs to take those signals seriously and
Yes,
address.
my input to that is that Jira is a great tool. Microsoft Team Services is a great tool, and they're very mature tools. Also, they have a lot of these controls in place, but at the same time, they try to put too many gates and controls, and kind of, so it becomes a heavy tool to manage, because of all the controls and all the features that it has. I recently, in the last few years, I have a tendency to use GitHub more, because it's very lightweight, it's agile, it's truly agile. You don't have to spend a lot of time managing the different pipelines and controls that all these other tools have, and I think it's a lot more friendlier to development teams and project managers and so on. So, but at the same time, all these tools achieve the same, right? They all do the same things. The purpose is the same. So it's really more of the culture of the team and the cost associated with how much money you want to spend on this.
Yeah, good point. And I mean, it gets back to the base of the Agile Manifest. Don't get hung up on tools and processes. It's more about people.
I I agree. I agree with that 100%. So yeah, don't get hung up too much on. And I've seen this, right? Oh, but all I know how to use Steam services or Jira. No, just pick up on the principles how to manage your process and your work, and any tool will do. But there's a little learning curve of how that tool operates, which is a challenge. But don't worry too much about the tool. But we have no more questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Grant. Such a great presentation. So please, everyone, we recorded this. We'll send the email after the presentation with the video link. Also, please, you're gonna get emails about feedback on the group. Please reply to that feedback and continue to follow us and join us on future presentations. Thank you, Grant, and thanks to everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, Oscar. Bye bye.
Thank you.